Hi guys, in this video we're going to talk about the massive farmers' protests in India against the controversial farm laws. Last time we talked about India, we discussed the impact of the CAA NRC protests and Modi's controversial citizenship laws, which resulted in a heavy-handed response and an outright ban on protesting in some parts of the country. While Modi survived that challenge, this time the unprecedented strength of the farmers' protests means that Modi has finally met the central challenge of his leadership. How did we get to this situation? Why are these agricultural laws so controversial? And will they work? And is this the end of Narendra Modi? All that in this video. The controversial nature of this topic means that this video will probably be demonetized, so consider becoming a Patreon so that I can keep covering topics like this. The largest protest in history. Since August, hundreds of thousands of farmers, mostly from the breadbasket states of the Punjab, Haryana, and Rajasthan, have converged on the major highways entering the capital, New Delhi. And in December, approximately 250 million people participated in a nationwide general strike, making it the largest protest in history. Farmers have overwhelmed the capital, establishing makeshift camps and stockpiling rations of food, aided by supporters, signaling to Modi that they are in it for the long haul. Only recently has some progress been made, with the farmers entering early negotiations with the government and the government promising to postpone the implementation of these laws. The farmers are protesting 3 agricultural reform bills. These laws essentially deregulate the Indian agricultural sector. The Farmers' Produce Trade and Commerce Act allows farmers to sell directly to private buyers outside of government-designated market yards or mandis, as well as to trade between states without any punitive taxes, market fees, or special licenses. The Farmers' Agreement on Price Assurance and Farm Services Act liberalizes the types of contracts farmers and buyers can enter into, paving the way for contract farming, while the amendment to the Essential Commodities Act loosens restrictions on private entities stockpiling essential produce. Now, to a Western audience, these sorts of liberalizing market reforms don't seem that controversial, and reforms to India's fragmented and inefficient agricultural sector have been long overdue. On top of that, Prime Minister Narendra Modi did not just campaign on Hindu nationalism, but also as a center-right neoliberal reformer, declaring that government has no business to be in business. So now that he's keeping that promise, why has the response been so negative? To understand this, we have to understand the history of India's agricultural sector and the Indian state. Agriculture or die. At independence in 1947, India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, faced a refugee crisis, mounting inflation, rampant poverty, and severe food shortages stemming from a mismanaged agricultural sector that couldn't keep pace with the growing population. More than 80% of the population was dependent on agriculture for their livelihood, while most of it was being done at a subsistence level, often in feudal arrangements. On top of that, the tragic Bengal famine of 1943 was still raw in the nation's psyche. 3 million people had died in the famine due to the economic mismanagement of the British. In this context, Nehru declared that everything else can wait, but not agriculture. And so agriculture became the central development goal of the newly independent India. To implement these development goals and address the food crisis, the Indian government enacted socialist-style 5-year plans and the regulatory structure that is still in place to this day. The first 2 5-year plans were successful in increasing agricultural output by a total of 33%. This put India on the path to food security. However, drought at the end of the third 5-year plan in 1965 resulted in a 19% drop in grain production, Because of prior investment in infrastructure and a stronger public sector, the Indian government was able to limit the impact of the drought, and it did not result in widespread famine. During this time, the Indian government set up APMCs, or government-regulated market yards, where farmers could sell their produce at prices fixed by the government. The government would then buy up some of this food to provide to the poor through the public distribution system. India's vulnerability to droughts made it dependent on foreign imports to feed its population, constraining it politically. For instance, when India criticized US involvement in the Vietnam War, the US restricted aid to India in the middle of the Bihar drought. Therefore, India's new goal became self-sufficiency in food, which initiated the Green Revolution. This program included the adoption of high-yielding varieties of crops, new fertilizers and irrigation techniques, but also new economic incentives. One of these was the minimum support price for crops like rice, wheat, and paddy, which especially benefited India's breadbasket states of Punjab and Haryana, precisely the states where farmers are protesting these new farm laws. India's agricultural system and the Green Revolution were successful in boosting agricultural output and achieving domestic food security. In the Maharashtra drought of 1973, India did not need to rely on foreign aid and was able to address the crisis through its national public distribution system. No deaths from starvation were reported. But there were also problems with this system. The license Raj. While the minimum support price was successful in increasing grain production and therefore achieving domestic food security, only about 5% of Indian farmers benefited from these policies, most of them concentrated in India's breadbasket states of Punjab, Haryana, and Rajasthan. And that's the main source of the protesters. The system of subsidies and government-run markets, as well as the Green Revolution, has created a myriad of problems in India's agricultural sector. The agricultural techniques promoted by the Green Revolution have increased productivity, but have also led to monoculture. This reduced crop diversity has led to declining soil fertility and dependence on pesticides. At the same time, government subsidies over-incentivized the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides and have led to overproduction, while free electricity and free water for farmers have led to depletion of the water table. But farmers cannot afford to abandon these agricultural practices and are caught in a vicious cycle. You see, in the Punjab, 72% of farmers own less than 5 acres of land. With such small plots of land, it is difficult to implement more efficient or mechanized farming methods due to economies of scale. At the same time, the complex system of government-run markets and licenses means that farmers are unable to access the necessary capital investment to become more productive and get out of this vicious cycle. So they turn to local moneylenders who charge insanely high interest rates, which has led to a debt crisis among Indian farmers, creating an epidemic of suicides. On top of that, at these government-regulated market yards, farmers are often exploited by middlemen and corrupt inspectors. You see, while farmers are guaranteed a minimum support price, the middlemen will bribe the government inspectors to label agricultural produce as poor quality so that it can be bought at a lower price, and so the middlemen pocket the difference. To top this off, India's rural infrastructure is underdeveloped and lacks adequate storage and transportation capabilities, which severely limits the geographical market available to Indian farmers, as fresh produce is unable to get very far without going bad. Because of infrastructural limits, farmers are unable to get their products to market on time, and so an estimated 16% of production goes to waste after the harvest. As a result of all these problems, India's crop yield is among the lowest in the world, and even with a highly active regime of subsidies and government intervention, farmers' incomes have been falling. It's clear that India's agricultural sector was in crisis well before these protests and well before these farm laws. But do these laws actually fix the problem? Neoliberal Reforms. Back in 2015, Narendra Modi promised to double farmers' incomes by 2022. Yet in 2021, that goal still looks incredibly far off. The main reason farmers oppose these laws is because they fear that it will mean the end of minimum support prices and the government-regulated markets. Now, while it's true that the laws don't directly abolish minimum support prices, they do increase the chance that farmers will get paid less. You see, liberalizing the market does not mean a free market per se. Farmers don't have the infrastructure or ability to sell to distant markets, leaving them to sell only to large corporate buyers. While the law allows them to now sell outside of the government-controlled markets, they will instead be selling to a handful of corporations who have market power. You see, in a true free market, there are many buyers and many sellers, and so no one can set the price. But in this case, you have something called an oligopsony, which is like a monopsony, but instead of one company setting the price, you have two or three who are able to control the market and effectively have the market power to be able to set the price, which will most likely be lower than the minimum support price guaranteed by the government. On top of that, undermining the role of these government-controlled markets will also take away the role of the middlemen. Now, while these middlemen are sometimes corrupt, they are also very important because they provide credit to farmers where traditional banks won't. Without them, farmers would be unable to finance their operations. On top of that, because farmers have been dependent on these government-run markets for so long, they lack the skills to negotiate prices in the private market, making it easier for the aforementioned corporations to pay them lower prices. This is especially likely now that contract farming has been deregulated. You see, contract farming is when a corporation agrees before the planting season to buy a certain amount of produce at a certain price. Now, this provides stability to farmers, but it also makes them dependent on these corporations, and the corporations are likely to be able to use their market power to negotiate for lower prices in the contracts. The courts and dispute settlement mechanisms for these contracts are largely seen as vulnerable to political pressure and corporate influence. What the farmers want is for these laws to be repealed and for minimum support prices to be enshrined in law. You see, India is a federal country just like America, so agriculture is largely left to the states. This means that currently, minimum support prices are not in fact a federal law, but simply an administrative order, and largely under the jurisdiction of the states. Farmers want it enshrined in federal law. So how will this play out? Modi's gamble. These protests are not too different from the Yellow Vest protests against President Macron in France. Just like Macron, Modi is facing a loss of popularity and a sustained protest movement after making some tough reforms. It's clear that something needs to be done to reform India's agricultural system, but whether these reforms are up to it is another question. Modi cannot use his bombastic style to push through these reforms in the same way he did with CAA NRC, the sales tax, or demonetization. Unlike the protests against Modi's controversial citizenship laws, which concerned Muslims, who are a less sympathetic group, the farmers, many of them Sikhs, have broad public support. Sikhs occupy a special place in India's culture and history and cannot be labeled as anti-national, which is what Modi has done to most of his other political opponents. He has to sit down with the farmers and come to some kind of compromise agreement. It's clear that the complex web of government regulations, licenses, subsidies, and markets needs to change. But at the same time, farmers do need some kind of simplified subsidy system so that they can get a fair price for their produce. Indeed, almost every country in the world offers subsidies to its farmers. So farmers cannot be thrown into the deep end with large corporations who may not pay them a fair price. At the same time, India needs to move away from the green revolution to more sustainable farming methods that don't leave farmers dependent on pesticides, heavily in debt, and degrading the soil on which they depend. After almost 6 months of sustained protests, it seems that the Modi government is ready to talk. It appears that the Modi government is finally learning what it means to govern in the world's largest democracy. To learn more about the protest against Modi's controversial citizenship laws, check out this video. This video will probably be demonetized, so consider becoming a Patreon so that I can keep making content like this. Thank you to my Patreons for making this video possible. Like, share, and subscribe, because this was my take.